to AI Home Podcast, the first podcast for real estate resources and independent living strategies for the disability community. Why? Because accessibility is home. Hi, I'm Angela Fox, blogger and author of My Blue Front Door. Today's episode is entitled I Can and I Will, because I will be talking about the unconscious bias that often prevents a person with a disability in believing that they can be homeowners and live fiercely independently. That will be the I Can portion of the episode. Then I will provide you a sort of Rosetta Stone by describing the basic terms about the various approaches to home design for the disability community, and a call to action for you to join the many voices who have said, I will. I will make housing design inclusive to all. So let's start with the basics. Can all disabilities really be homeowners or live independently, you may ask, or have heard many people ask that question to you? Of course not. There may be individuals with disabilities who will flourish only with constant medical treatments and supervision. But can a few mean that all cannot? Even the ones that are considered quote-unquote severe in nature, such as being paraplegic, also mean they cannot live independently or be a homeowner? The answer is also no. Yet, the idea of people with being homeowners is not part of mainstream thought, even with real-life examples of people living independently and being disabled. One of my favorite YouTube videos I use personally and professionally is by a female African advocate, Chimamanda Adichie, and I apologize if I butcher her name. But Ms. Adichie, in her speech called Danger of a Single Story, talks about how her family came from a very affluent African family and had servants from a nearby village. She grew up hearing from her mother how poor the villagers were, a sort of, pity. When she went to the village with her mother one day, she was surprised to see the wonderful artwork made by the village members village members. She had a single story that being poor meant that you could not do anything but survive, let alone create talented artwork. She states that where you start the story about people can shape its history of the other and create a single story. She gives an example of looking at the history of Africa. The history of Africa has been told from the point of colonization. And she says that by starting from the colonization, you ignore that there were many great civilizations that flourished for centuries. It's not about the fact that either story is not true. There were civilizations in Africa, and there were colonization of Africa. It is that both occur, and telling only one story makes the history of the people incomplete. Just think about it. When you think of Africa, do you think about the ancient civilization, or do you think about the slave trade? So good mindful opportunity there. So what is the single story for people with disabilities in housing? Sadly, a story of homelessness and rental income for low income, voucher aid, you name it. Here, the single story is created because where the able-bodied community start the story of disability housing. The story usually begins after the person becomes disabled, and financial hardship is also being experienced from the onslaught of medical bills. That's where the story starts. It is a short story, too. It's a short story because it does not follow the person for very long enough to even see if he or she eventually adjusts to becoming disabled. What would happen if the story begins before the person became disabled? Would we see that the person might have been struggling financially before they became disabled? Was the person's education or employment experience lacking? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, is it fair to say then that the reason why there is a struggle of home ownership to own your own home with a financial burden is simply because the person is disabled, when such opportunity may not have been feasible for that individual even before he or she became disabled, right? It's a wonderful way of kind of wrap your head around why we have this single story idea about people living independently. It's because we start the story perhaps after they became disabled, but then not when they might have been already adjusted. But if we understand why the single story persists, how do we change the story or create enough pause to stop the unconscious bias from going into action? I will be remiss if I don't bring up the great late Supreme Court Justice RGB. So at the time of writing this podcast episode, I heard of her passing, and I may be struggling in my grief. As a civil rights lawyer myself, I recall reading her scathing dissent opinions about Justice Scalia's decisions he made that slowly chipped away the intent of the original ADA Act of 1990. I remember arguing with my constitutional law professor and saying that change is coming from the baby boomers who will overturn the court. While I was off in the timing in which it occurred, I was right. It happened in the amendment of the ADA in 2008. Literally wrote in the preamble of the law that the 3 Supreme Court decisions by Scalia, called the trilogy cases, nickname, were being overruled. That has never occurred in any other civil rights law. It's more than the late Supreme Court Justice RGB dissenting opinions that helped overrule these ADA cases in the amendment. We should also be familiar with her role in gender equality. She first took on cases about men being treated differently than women. You heard me right. She took on cases that were about men. Why? She had great wisdom to understand that you must meet people where they are and to reframe the issue that includes everyone regardless of who they are or if they are of the majority. It was brilliant to show up as a woman, arguing that a man should get the same tax benefits of being a stay-at-home father as a woman was able to get at being a stay-at-home mother. Whether she intended to show that she could be part of the boys' club is really unknown, but she got street credit. Then she reframed the issue of women's reproduction rights as not about invading a woman's privacy by government laws, which it did, but that it was really about sex discrimination, not privacy. By focusing on sex and not gender, it opened the door for both men, women, and other genders to use the law for protection. Absolutely brilliant, and God rest her soul. For our purposes, by focusing that functional housing option is fundamental for the pursuit of happiness, as stated in the Constitution, is a way to reframe the issue that will include all. But to truly understand how we can talk about functional housing options, we must segue into the second portion of this podcast, the I will. I will is a pretty profound phrase. I will. Over the past century in America, many have come before me who have worked hard to get society to change policies and construction to mirror the belief that people with disabilities can live independently. The I will is not just a statement, but an executed action, a tangible object you can touch. Accessible housing. Many different design approaches have occurred over the recent few decades that have changed the framing of housing for disabilities. It's fitting to start with the legal requirements for accessible housing as the first design principle. If you Google accessible housing, you will likely first find housing that says ADA compliant. ADA compliant can have different meanings depending to whom is using the terminology. From a legal perspective, ADA compliant is saying that the building is built on the codes that are spelled out not in the ADA law, but accessibility guidelines or ADAAG in order to ensure that facilities that are open to the public or are financed through governmental funding are accessible. It does not mean that all housings are required to be accessible underneath the ADAAG because not all housing is open to the public, such as, for example, a condo, that's private housing. It's also sad that most housing is still driven by private funds for profit. To create even more confusion about the code, states and cities may have additional code requirements that go above the requirements in the ADAG or even in the Fair Housing Act that has some rental requirements. When this occurs, some may use the term ADA compliant as shorthand for accessibility for the disability based on the city and state code requirement. To create even more confusion, an individual selling his or her home may put language that the home is ADA compliant because the homeowner made modifications for accessibility, not understanding that it is actually a legal definition. Other than the word handicap accessible, which is not codified in law, or ADA compliance, is the most broadly used term to describe accessible housing. To learn more what is actually ADA compliant under the ADAG and not underneath the Fair Housing Act, please visit the Access Board, an independent federal agency that is in charge of updating the guidelines that developers can use to become ADA compliant. The Department of Justice also uses these guidelines by the Access Board to determine whether to pursue litigation against a state not following the code if they again have used federal money to build that home. As a person with a disability, relying on ADA compliance is not a bad thing if you keep it in perspective and you do some digging. When shopping for a home that you hope to already be accessible, look to see if the building unit is supported through governmental funds at either the county, state, or federal. If a rental home accepts Voucher 8, that is because they have received money through the federal agency called Home and Urban Development, or HUD. Then the homes must be ADA compliant for the location of facilities that are open to the public and also some of the rental units underneath the FAH. When the home is not funded by the federal government, it gets a little trickier to determine if the state or county government has provided the funds, because there are many layers of financing in the construction of the home or building, meaning they may be pulling many different sources, private and state, and maybe even federal. You may be inclined right now to just use the term ADA compliant for simplicity's sake. I get it. Don't, because the numbers of homes that fall underneath this term of ADA compliant is not in your favor, I'm afraid. According to the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, CBPP, which is a nonpartisan research and policy institute that focuses on reducing poverty and financial inequities, has stated that in 2019, about 10.4 million Americans get help with rental subsidies for housing. That may seem like a huge number, but when you take into consideration based on the 2010 U.S. Census of population, which is 308.7 million Americans, that's only 3% of America. You may believe that it's gotta be higher than 3.4 when you talk about disabilities, right? Your belief may depend on what percentage number you are hearing or looking at. It is only higher because of the population of people with disability. Out of 3.4 Americans that receive help for rent, 23% of that 3.4 are individuals with disabilities. If you are still not believing that only 3.4% of Americans get rental help for the home, now's a good time to remember that single story and the danger behind it. If you start talking again about home ownership for people with disabilities from the point about rental help, then you will have the perception that most people with disabilities cannot afford to be homeowners and must get rental help. In fact, 23% sounds like a big number, but that's only 23% out of 3.4% of American population. If most homes that are ADA compliant are built on federal and state funds, also reinforce this idea that it's too expensive for the private sector to be built without federal funds. An additional repercussion about this single story is that already ADA compliant homes, which again is used for rental help, will be limited to 3.4% of the population of homes that are accessible out there. That's why it's not a large enough pool for you to rely on this term of ADA compliant in your search. If you cannot really look into ADA compliant homes because the pool is just so little, what should you look for in the governmentally funded private sector's housing, right? You should be looking at other design principles used for housing development. The four main design principles that are part of your Rosetta Stone I mentioned are universal design, visibility, age and place, human-centered design that will make the Rosetta Stone. Let's start with the most common design when we are talking about accessibility for people with disabilities, which is called universal design. Universal design is to modify or design structures that can not only be used by the disability community, but also can provide a benefit to the non-disabled, or we call able-bodied community. The universal design principle makes it more palatable for developers to spend the extra money on modification simply because it is inclusive to all. Universal design has a long history, but it really didn't get its acceptance as a housing design until the 1960s as part of the social rights movement that was occurring in California and later in the country. Specifically, at the University of California, Berkeley, Ed Roberts, a pioneer leader, and other students with disabilities were actually forced to live in an empty wing of a nearby hospital as their dormitory. So naturally, they pushed to have the nearby sidewalks have ramps around the hospital and throughout the city. Many did not feel it was necessary or useful to have ramps on sidewalks. So the students decided to video record the usage of a sidewalk that happened to have a ramp to see if people actually used the ramp. Of course, other people use the sidewalk ramps, right? Which, these people, which include even today, delivery people, the elderly, and women with baby carriages, right? But at that time, it was the documentation that was needed that gave a real-life example for all that you can design something for the disability community, but it can also ensure that everyone can benefit from it. And again, it may seem pretty silly that ramps will not be used by everyone today. Universal design is, not universal yet. But the most common example of universal design right now being used is when you see a nice cemented ramp to the entryway of the home instead of those annoying 2 or 3 steps. You may not even notice that it's a ramp at all. It can also be seen when a home is advertised as age in place, which I will quickly describe next as the next Rosetta Stone design. Age in place design is truly a byproduct at the baby boomers retiring and having medical conditions that eventually lead to disabilities and are not conducive to the non-modified home they may be living in. Age in place technically means that your home is set up to support anyone at any age in a safe and independent manner. It can also include having the latest assistive technology, whether that is a smart device or something more specific for a person with a disability that may not have been adopted by the mainstream yet. So, as you can see, if things are added to the home that any age can use, then universal design is also part of the age in place. Pretty cool, huh? But more practically speaking, when you talk about age in place, you're really talking about having the right home modifications that when a person who is older will likely have mobility issues. And these mobility issues could be the needing of be able to use a wheelchair or prevent steps probably someone does not fall. Those are the type of modifications that you may be considering. If these modifications are present, it's likely that a part of the home is also considered what's another realtor term of one-level living. One-level living in an age-in-place home means that there is an accessible bathroom for a wheelchair on the ground floor. There is no entryway with steps into the home, and you have at least one bedroom on the ground floor. That is a one living level and also considered age in place. And now a quick break from our sponsor. So as you can see and also hearing me, I am sitting on my back deck and I have my grill. I love being out in my back deck. I hate when I forget something and I have to wheel back into the house, particularly my cell phone. However, I'm excited to announce that another disabled-owned business, Cush Pocket, has come up with a solution by creating this fabulous wheelchair bag. I love this bag and have been a proud customer since almost the very beginning. Why do I like it? 1, it's huge. 2, it comes in multiple colors. But 3, you can put it anywhere on the base of your wheelchair. How does that happen? It's attached to the flap and it has little Velcro. You put it directly underneath your cushion of your wheelchair. And the Velcro and the weight of your body ensures that this fabulous Cush Pocket bag certainly will not move. I personally have 2 directly in front of me and it hides behind my legs. And I love that because it's so much more convenient. Trust me, you will never forget anything ever again. So as you can see down below, I have a direct link for Cush Pocket. And if you use my code Angela Fox, you will get $1 off. And not only will you get a fabulous bag, but you'll also support 2 disabled-owned businesses, Cush Pocket and my business, Horizontal Houses. Check it out. So the next terminology, design I should say, is visibility. Visibility is the idea that all people with disabilities should have physical access and use of all homes, whether they are intending to live in them or not. The reason for this is to promote not only brand new construction of homes to be built as a default design, but also older facilities or buildings that may have multiple homes to be accessible to disabled visitors. An example might help. Imagine you have a friend who's in a wheelchair and you live in a condo. You ask for your friend to come see you, or maybe you're hosting a party she is invited to. Your friend may be able to easily get into the condo building because part of it, like the leasing office, is open to the public and is required to be accessible by law, so she can easily get into the building. But what happens when she's inside of your condo? Will your friend in a wheelchair be able to maneuver around hallway space? Or better yet, will she be able to get into the bathroom doorway and use her wheelchair and the toilet after she might have joined some, adult beverages? Unless that building makes every condo accessible, the chances are your friend will have to have a quick visit. I know that this has happened to me on so many occasions, and that's just looking at a condo. If it's a home, I can't even get into it. So as you can see, this design idea of visibility is focused not on people who may be disabled living in them, but the impact the community can have through social interactions among its residents. And those city residents should include people with disabilities. Focusing on design that is outside of the people who may be living in it really dovetails into our last Rosetta Stone housing design, which is called human-centered design. Human-centered design is the idea that a home can have many different functions or uses. But what is really unique about this design method is that you must actually talk to people who may be using the building, the home, among the community that it may be at. Incorporate the feedback into any necessary changes when constructing the home or building. It may seem kind of like, why isn't that being done by the other designs? However, going back to the single story danger, if an architect or a developer have on the onset this idea, the homes that they're going to be building will be used for single family homes. Their focus is going to be on what single family home needs are. A lot of examples surrounding us may be making your home environmentally friendly by adding solar panels or using natural light through more windows, are things that no matter if it's family, multi, for disabled, for the elderly, we all may want to have solar panels or have more access to windows. Everybody would like to save money on electrical bills through both of these examples. So if you don't have that human-centered design feedback session, you're not going to have that opportunity to learn that. So to summarize that, all the principal designs I talked about are key to ensure that homes include the diversities that's within people with disability, as well as to ensure that the disability community is included in living and visiting homes around them. But I must leave you with some realistic facts. According to the League, which is another nonprofit organization that has adopted a lot of the spirit and guidelines behind the Federal National Center for Living Independent, has stated that less than 2% of homes will be accessible for wheelchairs, and only 5% of homes will be livable for all disabilities. Why is that? Why is it that, you may ask, if these design principles, those principles on your Rosetta Stone, are there to showcase the need and the benefits to the homeowner and the community? Why aren't we having more accessibility homes? The development of housing in our country is directly impacted by the marketability and economics. Most homes that you develop are very cookie cutter as far as how they look and are designed. The reason behind this, design in a standardized way, then the materials should be very cheap because there's no special order being needed for those materials. Furthermore, city zoning is done internally without residents' input in most cases. Also, the housing industry as a whole, whether it is an architect, home improvement contractor, a developer, realtor, or even city governmental representatives, do not have someone with a disability at the table to raise these issues that may seem neutral on its face, but actually discriminate or have a negative impact on making homes accessible for the disability community. But I don't want to leave you feeling discouraged because, again, the purpose of this podcast is the I can and I will be a homeowner and live fiercely independently with a disability. So I have a call to action. For residents, please visit at least once your city council meetings and ask whether people with disabilities and disability advocates are at the table when making city housing initiatives. You may be very surprised that even when there's a board that have residents on them, that people with disabilities are not considered a necessary membership to have when selecting the right resident to be on the board. If you are a realtor, you work very closely with brokers and also home inspectors. Therefore, please talk to the brokers that if there are any future home developers building new homes, that these design principles be used. Also, realtors, don't forget to mention these design principles to your home inspectors who can document some of the modifications that may exist, but yet have not been included in the MLS listing from the seller. There's a tendency to think that it's not going to be marketable if you have modifications listed, and that is false. Finally, home improvement contractors, it is very important that you do not discourage modifications for fear of being potentially in trouble with permit requirements underneath the ADAAG. It's also equally important and lucrative for you as well that if you see a person that clearly could benefit with age-in-place modifications and are maybe just asking for cosmetic changes because they feel that at their age they need to sell their home and they won't be able to live with a disability, you need to mention that there is this idea of age in place and figure out a way to make modifications to the home, probably the homeowner can stay in the home a lot longer. Not everybody has this idea about age in place. You may feel intimidated about these design principles in various ways to make changes to your homes, and that's okay. Most of you who are disabled will become disabled sometime statistically after your 27th birthday, and therefore you literally did not grow up with disability issues. For those who may be in a housing market, you may be fearful of fair housing discrimination complaints, or even having the ability to articulately describe these design principles. That is also okay to have those feelings. But rest assured, where Housing Act discrimination complaints are successful, it's not the fact that you have identified that person as being disabled, but you have treated them in a negative way because of their disability, and you would not have done the same thing if they were not. So if you bring up there's some information about being a wounded warrior or low income resources, or even if you know that a woman has children, she may want to have a home nearby a good school. Well, you have identified that woman as being a woman and a mother, but you still do it anyways because it's good resources. You are advocating for your client. This is no different if you see somebody who might be in age in place or disabled. I will conclude this podcast by saying that I will be creating additional handouts on my blog about these design principles and any tips I can give you to help you talk to various stakeholders. But I am begging you all, we all can contribute to housing design, and you'll be amazed how many times merely mentioning these design principles and talking about the single story danger approach really will make people to at least stop, overcome those unconscious bias, and make small changes. Thank you. In conclusion, I want to remind everyone listening that it takes a village to make a change. Nothing can live just within ourselves. So I invite you to join my Facebook page, Accessibility is Home, to ask your questions about real estate and independent living concerns for your disability. Or, better yet, just share your success stories. And please use the hashtag #HomesForDisabled on all of your social media networks. Don't forget to join my Instagram and Twitter at DoorMyBlue, which is short for the title of my book on Amazon called My Blue Front Door. I have also created a website for my book, blog, and of course this podcast, which can be found at www.angelafoxbooks.com. Please don't forget to check out my free handouts and interesting articles on my blog's website. So thank you for listening to this podcast because accessibility is home.